Hello, everyone out there. This is Tom, your instructor. We are moving. We are over halfway through the course of the term. We are into advertising and branding the next couple weeks. So super interesting, fascinating content and information. The article is an academic journal article. So I just wanted to provide you a little bit of information, background on some concepts, ideas that are being floated around in the articles. It's a little bit more technical than the readings from last week or previous weeks. So that's kind of the goal and the purpose of this video. Just as a reminder, just your summary points for your, isolating three main issues, ideas that are coming from the article, summarizing those or creating a note sheet. Either way, whatever works for you. Go back to week 6 folder for an overview of the requirements for that. And as a reminder too, for the wiki, just put in your name. It's like Tom Wiki week 7, Tom Wiki week 8. Create a new wiki page each time. I think it'll be easier to keep track. Make sure you post by Thursday and then respond by Sunday. I won't go in after Sunday. And I grade them on Monday usually. I won't go in after that time period to look to see if somebody added feedback to folks afterwards. So if you miss it by Sunday night, you just kind of miss that part. Okay, so in the article, it's basically the focus is on looking at advertising and looking at advertising of food and gender, representations of gender. Super interesting, very narrow, right? Very narrow topic, looking at one particular thing, looking at food and representations of food, and looking at the ways in which gender is being represented in practices and in rituals around food. So a couple terms to bring up that I think will shed light on how to look at advertisements and sort of why advertisements can be really powerful and really illustrative of culture and other things that are going on. One concept is this idea of doing gender. That was identified. It's a concept that comes out of some academic work in the 1970s and 1980s. And make sure we separate out sex and gender. Sex is things that are determined by or influenced and shaped by biological, physiological differences between individuals, right? So that's sex. Gender is social cultural. So things that are kind of social cultural influences and forces. Some things that we may think may be sex characteristics are really gendered characteristics or more primarily gendered. Oftentimes these are very interactive. Our focus is going to be much more on the gendered side of the influence of social and cultural environment. So for example, historically thought that males were better at math, stronger at math, that wired, brain development, wired for spatial reasoning and for computational mathematical skills. I think, research now is indicating that's not the case. It's not a sex characteristic, but rather a gendered characteristic. It's a lot of social learning, social cultural forces that are going on that are shaping the development of mathematical aptitude in different ways for different populations. So it's a gendered characteristic, not a sex characteristic. Most of stuff that we do, we think about the world around us for being shaped by a lot of forces. And so our focus is going to be examining those gendered forces. Okay, so to go back to this idea of doing gender. This idea is that gender is something that we practice. Gender is something that, we may embody certain things, but gender is something that we do, right? So the way that we walk, our language, our body posture, our demeanor, our mannerisms, how we hold a cup, how we look, our eye contact, are the ways that we non-verbally communicate. All these are practices. All these are ways in which we do gender. Makes me think about watching a movie years ago called Marley and Me. And animal films get to my heart like all the time. We're watching Marley and Me, and there's a scene, it's about a dog and a family. The dog ends up passing away. We're in the movie theater, and tears are rolling, just rolling down my eyes, and I was like, oh man, I don't have a tissue, so just letting these tears just sort of drip down my cheeks. And I started, thought about it later. It's like, oh, that's such a great example, like doing gender, like how we cry is a practice. And we cry in different ways based on who we are as individuals, but that's also shaped by patterns and ideas of gender. So gender is something that we practice, something that we do, and sometimes we follow a gendered script. Okay, so this gets into the ideas of Irving Goffman and dramaturgy, that the world is a stage, we are performers on that stage, and in this case, there's an interaction ritual going on, so that when we are engaging in gender, we're actually engaging in, we have a script. There's a male script, there's a female script, there's increasingly a transgendered script, right? There's these scripts that we follow. So gender comes from practices, it comes from the things that we do, and we also keep in mind that there's individual agency in gender. So agency is about individual power, individual influence, individual interpretation. So we all don't do gender in the same way. There may be pattern ways of doing gender, but we all negotiate that space in different ways. So we all have agency in terms of how we negotiate that. And in this case, in this article, looking specifically of the ways in which representation of gendered practices, the ways of doing gender, are represented in food, okay, and advertisements around food. One concept that the authors bring up that you talk about as well is this idea of hegemonic masculinity. Hegemony, if you go back to conflict theory week 1, this is a long time ago, so don't expect you to remember this sort of concept, but in week 1, there was a reading on conflict theory. And conflict theory, the idea of hegemony is domination by consent, right? So that a system of patriarchy is maintained not by state control, or not by control by law and practices in terms of legal institutional practices. That's not the only way in which inequalities can be reproduced. Rather, we can reproduce them ourselves. Like, we do that, and it's by consent. And there's a sort of like domination by consent is one way of defining hegemony. So that the practices that males engage in, or that females may engage in, may reinforce gendered inequality. So we become the carriers of ideology. We become the carriers of belief and values and practices that reinforce a system of inequality around gender. So they use the example of hegemonic masculinity and red meat. So the consumption of red meat becomes a sort of thing as a masculine practice, right? To be male is to be carnivorous. And I think we've kind of moved away from that a little bit, but I think it's so interesting to kind of poke around in that a little bit and start to raise the question about, vegan and how to think about social class position, educational position, and veganism or vegetarianism. It's a move away from that hegemonic masculinity. So it's a critique in some sort of way. So through our food and our food practices, we're actually kind of challenging these sort of individuals who are vegetarian and vegan are challenging that dominant hegemonic masculine ideal. They may not be doing that consciously, but that's one interpretation of what things that are going on. Okay, so there's hegemonic femininity. There's the hegemonic masculinity. There's hegemony also around femininity, and practices around femininity as well. One of the things the author introduces is, in advertisements, nothing is neutral. I mean, in any symbol, nothing is neutral. In any representation, it's not neutral. So we got to sort of peel back some layers. When we see an advertisement, it's important to critique it, ask questions, look at the representation. Think about those 3 parts of the cultural studies tradition, right? The production of culture. So to ask the question about who's producing, what's their motive for producing, how are those institutions structured, how are the mediums in which we're viewing something being shaped, like that's all production side, right? Then we get the textual analysis, so analyzing the text. That's kind of what's going on mostly in this article is textual analysis. And then the third part of cultural studies is audience reception. How do different audience members interpret a particular ad? Dolce & Gabbana, these ads that are highly problematic in so many ways and so powerful in terms of gender representation. Different audience members based on age, gender, social class may have different interpretations of these particular ads. But ads are not neutral. I mean, that's the point to stress. And sometimes the things about food, they seem very normal every day. Like there's nothing going on. It's just a picture of a family eating, right? But there's ideology that's contained within that particular advertisement. There's ideology or beliefs or ways of thinking that are built behind that particular representation. A quote from the article is that representations are an interpretation. I think I wrote that down right. Interpretation, or it's an intervention. That's my word. An intervention into the world. So any advertisement, it's like it's being brought into the world. It doesn't fall out of the sky, but it's being created and brought into the world. I think that's kind of an important kind of way of thinking about it or framing that. And oftentimes advertisements display, this is what the authors argue or position, that often display extreme gender polarization. So these gendered roles, and somewhat like the mythology of the 1950s is still with us, the sort of two-parent breadwinner, caretaker of the home, domestic for the female, producer for the male, like this sort of model of suburbia America, 1950s, post-World War II consumer culture, like this Norman Rockwell vision of the American family is still part of sort of where we're at. So like that gender polarization tends to be repeated in gendered advertisements. So final concept to introduce is the gaze and is the issue of gaze. So the gaze is basically like looking at something, right? To be gazing. Now, one thing to think about is to be the object of the gaze, right? To be looked at, or to be the gazer, the one looking. And there's a lot of I don't know, theory, research background in this whole area of the power of the gaze, right? So the gaze represents sort of the power of the observer. The gazer, the language of the author, the gazer dominates the object of the gaze. So we look at the word like objectification, right? We don't usually apply that to female representations of women. And to say that women are often objectified, right? Certain parts of their body are represented. They're depersonalized. They're viewed in terms of, as product in a way, or, just sort of dehumanized, depersonalized, that objectification. So they're the object of attention. And not only just the object, but object of very specific parts of who they are, right? Usually about their body, but we also have to think about what they're doing and what their practices as well. So there's a lot of power in the gaze. Now the gazer, the author kind of doesn't go into this too much, but we can think about the gaze. The gazer can be a male gaze, it can be a female gaze, it can be a transgender gaze, it could be a queer gaze. It can be different gazers looking at the object, right? And without getting too complicated, we've got to start thinking about, as we're seeing something, we're looking at an advertisement. In one way, we are the gazer looking at the advertisement, right? We are looking at the image, we're looking at the representation. But also we kind of try to get into a little bit is that this is also a representation that we're internalizing. Like this is the ways in which gender is being represented. I'm thinking about my own practices, or, so it's kind of turning itself back onto oneself in that regard. So a little bit two different issues going on there. The one that the author is kind of focused on more is this issue of the gendered gaze, the way of looking at, when we see a representation, we start thinking about the issue of like, who is the audience member looking, and when there's, in terms of demographic, who that audience member is, in terms of what is their age, race, gender, class, that's sort of the gazer, right? Sort of thinking about the gazer. But then also sort of thinking about there's power in that. To be the one who's observing is in a position of power over the one being observed. In advertisements, there's oftentimes objectification. So it's reinforcing this idea in terms of disempowerment, oftentimes of females, and disempowerment and reinforcement of patriarchy. Okay, so that may be a little bit too complicated, but it's sort of the general idea. I just want to introduce that to you. Don't get too hung up on that, but just kind of an important thing to sort of, I don't know, just kind of start thinking about as you're looking at representations. For the wiki this week, what I want you to do is find 2 food advertisements about food. They can be from the United States. It can be from a different country. If they come from a different country, if you could identify what country they come from, because it'll be important that we're able to place that ad in a cultural context. So 2 different advertisements, and post the image within the wiki itself, and then provide a 150 to 250 word kind of discussion about the representations and how they're illustrating some ideas from the article. So incorporate information from the article into your analysis of the representations. Yeah, okay, that's about it. Thanks for all you do. If you have any questions, let me know. Have yourself a great day and a great rest of your week. Signing off. This is Tom. I'll catch you next week.